So, good morning, everyone. Welcome back for the last day of our conference and for the panel on knowledge. It's my great pleasure to introduce the speakers, one of whom will be joining us with a pre-recording. And we will begin with Niall Green, who has handed in a pre-recorded presentation that runs a little bit longer than 10 minutes from the University of California, Los Angeles. His talk will be entitled Translating Confucius for the Indian Reading Public, a Case Study in Commensurability. This is then followed by DAMIANO MATASCI from the University of Geneva, who will be speaking about inter-imperial institutions and scientific cooperation in late colonial Africa. And next is Daniel LAQUA from Northumbria University, who will speak about university students as subjects and actors of Transimperial history, a case study. And finally, MIGUEL Bandeira JERÓNIMO from the University of Coimbra, who will be speaking about the politics of inter-imperial exchanges, context, actors, dynamics, 1940s till 1960s. This is then, as always, followed by a Q&A session until 11:15, when we then head over to the brunch. Thank you.
To be there with you all in person. My thanks, of course, to Shire for organizing the conference. Hello, greetings to you from Los Angeles. I'm sorry I'm not able to be there with you all in person. My thanks, of course, to Shire for organizing the conference and to David Mutsafi Hala for making so many things possible for us, whether in person or very remotely in my case. Well, I'm talking today about a case study in commensurability via the earliest, as I've been able to establish it, the earliest translation of Confucius, or work attributed traditionally to Confucius, into a South Asian language, in this case Urdu, a translation that takes place as late as 1937. And I'll be using this text then to address some larger questions of how East Asia was understood in South and more broadly also in West Asia, which is to say how Chinese cultural traditions were interpreted in India and to some extent as well in passing, at least in the paper, in the Middle East as well. These are themes I've taken up in a sort of larger survey in my forthcoming book, How Asia Found Herself, when I try to understand how the Middle East and South Asia tried to understand the Buddhist, Confucianist, Taoist, and Shintoist traditions and indeed texts of East and Southeast Asia. One of the issues we face, but often I think as scholars haven't confronted in these now very fashionable, very lively, very current discussions and field of inter-Asia interactions, inter-Asian understanding, is the problem that Asia itself is a borrowed concept. Asia itself has been taken, I would argue, as being an emic, static, stable, physical and cultural entity. That's to say, Asia has been assumed to be universal, ahistorical, hard geographical fact. But actually, Asia is a historically generated and indeed contested etic European concept that is only exported, this concept and indeed this word Asia is only exported to the region that it terms Asia, the spaces that it terms Asia, in a series of translations of maps and geographies from the 17th century onwards, and especially in the 19th century. So this is one of the problems we face within this field altogether before we can even do any actual case studies of the kind I'm proposing, and I carry on throughout my book, of looking at actual instances and actual evidence for how different regions and persons of Asia interpreted different Asian cultural traditions. The Silk Road is another false friend, one of the various faux amis that confront us in these attempts to measure inter-Asian commensurability. The term itself, of course, was famously only invented by the Prussian geologist Ferdinand von Richthofen in 1877 and passed on via his Swedish student Sven Hedin, whose 1939 work, Siebenwegen, was translated into English in the following year, and then slowly made its way from English, the term Silk Road, into Chinese, into Japanese, and subsequently Chinese, Persian, and Urdu. So it's a misleading external conceptual Wanderwort, a term that travels from Europe through a number of Asian languages, but actually isn't available as a borrowed emic concept by peoples and languages in Asia until after the 1940s and largely after the 1960s. So we have to be wary of thinking of the Silk Road as either itself a thing that was there, long-term continuities of inter-Asian connections, transfers of knowledge, and thereby commensurabilities. And indeed, the assumption that the notion of a Silk Road was even there for Asians thinking about such forms of interconnection, even in the 20th century. Well, before I turn to my case study itself, I want to refer to a few of the earlier texts then, because of course, 1937, is this so, why is this text so late? Is this the first South Asian or Middle Eastern account of China or Chinese cultural traditions or linguistic traditions? Well, yes and no. Well, no, because of course, as any world history textbook would tell you, there are a number of famous Middle Eastern so-called Silk Road, maritime Silk Road, overland Silk Road attempts to understand China. Ibn Battuta and Rashid ad-Din's Jami Tawarikh, Compendium of Histories. But these are, on the one hand, not accounts of a Confucian China. They're really accounts of an Arab Muslim China in Battuta's case, and of a Buddhist China in Rashid ad-Din's case. And moreover, these medieval manuscript texts weren't widely disseminated and available, and certainly not widely printed, as to be available for 19th and 20th century South and West Asian scholars who tried to interpret China in this newer imperial age of inter-Asian interactions in the 19th and 20th century. There were a series of early modern texts as well. And what's particularly interesting here is the most detailed account in a Middle Eastern or South Asian language I found in my research was the 17th century Persian translation of the famous Jesuit Latin account of China by Matteo Ricci. It was translated by a Safavid Iranian Muslim convert to Christianity, Paolo Zaman, who fled to the Mughal court and there came across with a Catholic Jesuit friend, the Latin text, translated it into Persian. As I argue in a forthcoming article in the Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society, what we have here, though, is effectively an Islamicate Persian representation or translation of a Christianate Latin attempt to interpret Confucianism and Buddhism. This creates a whole series of conceptual blockages as much as there's a transmission through these languages then through this Latin Christian intermediary, a transmission of knowledge of China to the Middle East, Safavid Iran, and to the South Asia, the Mughal Empire, there are a whole series of blockages, not least because neither 17th century Latin nor 17th century Persian have a word for the Buddhist religion. So the word that gets taken into Latin and then into Persian is a Chinese term taken itself from a Sanskrit term that when it comes into Persian as Sikia means literally nothing. The word doesn't feature in any Persian dictionary. So this is just one of the various kind of conceptual, linguistic, labeling issues of incommensurability in this case. That what does one do when there is not even a word for something, a name for something in one's own language? Pointing us back to actually, ironically, one of the most famous sayings of Confucius himself, the call to rectify the names. The whole series of other texts in Indian languages, in many cases, in fact, in all cases, pretty much other than travelogue accounts of visually witnessed China, largely these were accounts rendered into Urdu, Bengali, or Gujarati of missionary depictions of China and translations by this period, Protestant missionaries in a series of texts that start to be published in Calcutta and Bombay, and from there exported to regions of the Middle East from the 1860s onwards. Scaling the linguistic wall of China there remains a constant problem. The closest I've come to finding any, as it were, dictionary or linguistic tool for interpreting China is this 1902 word book, vocabulary guide for spoken Chinese, I think actually probably spoken Beijing dialect. But as you can see here from the image, this is actually spoken vernacular Chinese transliterated into the Devanagari Hindi and the Arabic Urdu script, which is to say, this might help, as indeed it was intended, Indian soldiers to speak Chinese, to speak vernacular Beijing dialect, but it wouldn't help anybody to read a single character in whether modern Chinese, still less literary, or the classical Chinese of the Confucianist syllabus and Confucius's text. The Sahifai Chin in our case study shows this similar development then of drawing upon, in fact, many series of European texts. It is in itself a translation, as I discovered to my immense disappointment at first, but subsequent curiosity and interest then, a translation of a 1904 translation of the Xu Jing, the classic of history, as it's often called in English, by Walter Gorn Old, otherwise known as Safarial, because he was a British theosophist and astrologer who wrote more often under the pen name Safarial. This translation was published in Benares in India by the Theosophical Society, hence being available to Anwari, the Delhi-based translator into Urdu. We always have to think what texts were available, and the texts that were available then was in this case this Indian theosophical imprint of a translation by an amateur sinographer who himself largely borrowed his translation from an earlier missionary translation by Medhurst, the famous Singapore-based missionary Christian missionary to the Chinese, the Straits Chinese, who had made his translation in the 1840s. What we see here then, a whole series of entangled translations and a series of uses of not only Christian, Catholic, or Protestant pivot languages and pivot texts, but indeed theosophical ones as well. This was similarly the case with Buddhist South Asian interactions with East Asia, whether through the Ceylonese missionary Dharmapala, who himself had studied with Henry Alcott, the co-founder of the Theosophical Society, whose own Buddhist catechism was translated into many Asian languages, but itself drew much of its notion of Buddhism from Orientalist accounts and translations of Sanskrit and particularly Pali texts. So we have these actually whole series of intermediary texts and the use of European, whether Christian or indeed theosophical pivots. What we see in the Shujing in Urdu then, with the translator Anwari's and various interpretive strategies, is the use of pivot languages, what interpreters call pivot languages then. I don't think this is another familiar story of Orientalism. I think it's something more complex, interesting, and actually more widespread across the world history of translation practices, which is the use of what, as I say, linguists call a pivot language to avoid the problem of the duplication of the so many different languages, which is to say, rather than having to train, in this case, in 10 different Indian scholars to translate from Urdu to Chinese, from Urdu, from Japanese, from Urdu to Thai, from Urdu to Arabic, etc., one could use a pivot language, English, and Indian scholars knew English, and Anwari was educated English medium at the Aligarh Muslim University, and hence he, like so many other Indian and other Asian scholars, needed only to translate from English as the pivot language. But Anwari, like various other Middle Eastern and South Asian interpreters of East Asia, also used a pivot chronology, which we now call the Common Era chronology, but was very clearly in such texts the Christian pivot chronology of Qabl al-Masih, of before the Messiah, of BC datings then, which were used as a standardized pivot chronology to interpret ancient Chinese history, because there was no equivalent Islamic, let's say, before Hijra dating system. There are also many conceptual borrowings as well in terms of the lexicon, the term classic, adopted from European scholarship of Greek and Latin to conceiving Chinese texts in these terms, and indeed taking that conception into Urdu in this case. But still there remained, actually, was there any place for China in this story? Well, yes, absolutely, because the dynastic Confucianist paradigm of Chinese history, what the University of Chicago scholar Howard So-Si has referred to as the China as an artwork whose medium is history. That's to say, China being understood, whether by Europeans and indeed by Asians, as being understood in this statist, centrist, Confucianist dynastic paradigm, which indeed is what the Shujing is, an account of ancient Chinese dynasties. In conclusion, then, what we see is the great challenges of inter-Asian understanding, the linguistic Great Wall of China being extremely difficult to climb except via roundabout pivot languages of European origin. The exceptions, of course, and one of the reasons of this, I should say, is because the Sinosphere has its own regional geography. Vietnam, Korea, to some extent Japan, but that Sinosphere doesn't move westwards, not even into Xinjiang, into Chinese Central Asia, as Ryan Thum has demonstrated, let alone kind of further westwards. Hence the need for both pivot languages and pivot chronologies. Returning then to the issue of commensurability there, this means that when looking at inter-Asian understanding and inter-Asian commensurability, we have to ask, well, commensurable with what and with whom? What we actually see in the Urdu Shujing, as indeed with earlier Islamic language and indeed other South Asian language accounts of China, is actually a China understood through Christian concepts, a Christianate China, in turn rendered into Islamic languages, Arabic, Persian, Urdu, there becomes an Islamic China that actually takes through again a Christian Chinese terms, including, of course, the Latinization of Confucius as Confucius, and that name Confucius is transliterated over and again, still to this day, into Arabic, Persian, and Urdu. But there's also, as we've seen, theosophical concepts of a theosophic China also gets placed in then into Urdu as Confucius as the great philosopher and indeed astrologer. But nonetheless, we still have that Confucianist statist paradigm of China seen as this dynastic model that does manage nonetheless to make its way through these various linguistic and other interpretive barriers. The last thing I'll say then, well, does this mean that China and inter-Asian knowledge is ultimately incommensurable? Well, no. What I've tried to argue here in short is only when we look at particular case studies of particular texts can we see ways in which different authors in different times and places have tried to tackle the problem of commensurability. In some ways through these pivot languages and chronologies, in other cases through finding a Buddhist or representations of China or Buddhist notions of China that themselves actually drew on projections of an Indian origin Buddhism, China through Indian lenses, but often from drawing upon or interacting with European Buddhist-focused sinology. In the case here of the Urdu translations of Xuanzang then. But we can also, in other cases then, very rarely, but nonetheless very significantly, see more direct cases then of translations. In this case, as in the other most direct cases of inter-Asian communication and translation directly were in fact through Hui Chinese Muslims. And in this case, Muhammad Makin, the Chinese Muslim, as he was known in Arabic, Marjan as he's known with his Chinese name, in 1935 publishes in Cairo the earliest and an extremely rare, even today, direct translation from classical Chinese into Arabic. But here too, even Marjan Muhammad Makin had to face his own conceptual and linguistic choices into how he would term and phrase Confucian ideas in Arabic and indeed in Islamic terms, not least by presenting Confucius as a philosopher and not as the founder of a rival religious system. That, though, is another story for another day. My apologies for taking up so much of your time. Thank you for listening.
Forward.
Yeah. Perfect. Thank you very much, David. Good morning to everyone. And so, first of all, a warm thank you to Cyrus, David, and also to Madame Pierre du Bois for organizing this great conference. So what I want to do in my presentation this morning is to briefly present the key points of my paper and also the specific contribution to my paper to the general debate on inter- and transimperial histories. So this paper is part of a broader research project that explores the connection between science and empire in late colonial Africa. As you can guess, this is a huge field of research, but I would say until recently this topic has been addressed mainly by focusing on a single metropole, colony, or empire, or by studying networks of science within empires. My objective is to overcome, or to try to overcome this national imperial framework and to show the ways in which empires developed forms of cross-border cooperation that finally covered all fields of human and natural sciences. To this end, I choose to work on a set of inter-imperial institutions established in the 1940s, the most well-known of which were the Commission for Technical Cooperation in Africa south of the Sahara and the Scientific Council for Africa south of the Sahara. So, as I explain in the paper, these institutions were expressions of a new form of cooperative colonialism, which drew on, but also at the same time differed from the mechanism of transfers and exchange that emerged at the end of the 19th century or even during the interwar period. Why? Because it was precisely only in the 1940s, during the 1940s, that inter-imperial cooperation in Africa was established on a permanent institutional basis and included for the first time official representatives from all European colonial powers, as well as from Southern Rhodesia and the Union of South Africa. The inception of this collaboration is very interesting to investigate, and Miguel will precisely do that in a few minutes in his presentation. And for my part, I just want to say a few words on how inter-imperial cooperation was implemented in the 1950s. Basically, it took two forms. On the one hand, about 100 so-called inter-African conferences were organized under the aegis of CCTA and CSA on a wide range of topics, bringing together hundreds, if not thousands, of experts from different national and imperial backgrounds. On the other hand, joint projects were also undertaken, which led to the production of atlases and maps. And you can see here on the right the result of one of the first joint projects of the CCTA, CSA, which was the production, the elaboration of an atlas climatologique d'Afrique, which included more than 50 maps. Other projects led to the publication of a series of studies on social and economic issues, but also to campaigns aimed to combat tsetse flies, locusts, and rinderpest. And by the way, locust control was precisely one of the major fields of inter-imperial cooperation. I am working right now for my project. And during the 1940s, 1950s, 3 organizations were established in Africa on a regional basis to deal with this problem. So, inter-imperial institutions were places where scientific knowledge on the African natural and human environment was collectively produced. From a methodological point of view, and this is key for me, I think it's important to look at these institutions through a social history approach. This means that I consider them as social spaces, namely as fields of observation for examining how people, ideas, and practice were circulated, compared, and also confronted in a rapidly changing global context. We can do that, for instance, by looking at the debates, of course, that took place during the inter-African conferences, but also by following individual trajectories of experts, such as the British biologist Edgar Barton Worthington, who is the first guy on the left of the picture, who was the first Secretary General of the Scientific Council for Africa, and who traveled in the early 1950s across the continent in an attempt to connect researchers and colonial institutes. So the first point I want to emphasize this morning is that the inter-imperial organizations are, in my opinion, very good places to observe dynamics of cooperation, connectivity, and competition between empires, which are key aspects of transimperial history, as Daniel Edinger and Nadine A. have pointed out. Inter-imperial institutions, and this is my second point, also provide new insights into what Frédéric Couper has defined as the imperialism of knowledge, namely the increasing role of science in colonial governance and politics. Indeed, since its very beginning, the aim of technical cooperation, such a kind of technical cooperation between empires, was to support the modernization of colonialism, and more particularly, the wide range of development programs and schemes that were launched after the Second World War. Knowledge production and I think that there is a problem with the PowerPoint, but okay. There is just a problem with the second picture, but it doesn't matter. So continue. So knowledge production and circulation were expected to make the mise en valeur of African territories more efficient, as well as to contribute to the elevation of living standards of local populations, especially with regards to health and education. So, and from this point of view, inter-imperial institutions illustrate quite well, in my opinion, something that has also been mentioned by Nadine A. 2 days ago, namely the shared interest among empires for the production of useful knowledge, as well as the importance of science and research in the technocratization of colonial politics. In my case, such processes helped in establishing what at the time was defined as an inter-African scientific agenda, which was, and this is also an important point, which was implemented locally by national colonial research institutes. Therefore, this implies the importance to pay attention to what in French we say jeu d'échelle, analytical scales. And I think that one way to do that is to focus on the circulation of people and ideas, circulation of experts, for instance, between inter-imperial, international, imperial, and colonial levels. Or also to look at the way in which what we can define the inter-imperial sphere contributed to shaping the politics of scientific research in various national and colonial contexts. Finally, and this is my third and last point, it's also important to underline that inter-imperial organizations were also part of a broader strategy aimed at re-legitimizing the idea of colonialism civilizing mission. And this re-legitimation took place on the national but also on the international scene. So in other words, in a time of imperial crisis, they also served very political and diplomatic purposes. The first purpose was to showcase the colonial powers' commitment towards the well-being and welfare of African populations. And this was also a way to oppose anti-colonial propaganda and to show the adequacy of colonial politics to the UN developmentalist agenda. The second purpose was to protect the empire from any external interferences, especially from UN organizations, which were increasingly involved in technical assistance activities in Africa, especially after 1949. So, in other words, the idea was to create a specific and quite alternative space for regional cooperation to better navigate the new post-war international landscape. And by the way, this project drew on the old idea of Eurafrica, which has also been discussed by Anne-Isabelle in her paper. So it's clear that inter-imperial institutions were conceived at least at the very beginning and in the early 1950s as colonial clubs. But at the same time, and this is also very important to keep in mind, they also were very flexible and open bodies that adapted very quickly to the new challenges of the decolonization process. Just want to give you two short examples. First, from the mid-1950s, they progressively included African independent states, and therefore also African scholars. And quite paradoxically, inter-imperial organizations paved the way for a truly Pan-African cooperation that will become effective in the early 1960s, when the CCTA and the CSA finally merged in 1965 with the Organization of the African Union. Second, colonial experts circulated, despite competition and rivalries with international organizations, for instance. Colonial experts circulated within, of course, various imperial spaces, but also between imperial circles and UN organizations, as I have shown in my paper. And I think that this can offer interesting perspectives on the social and intellectual dynamics of what Véronique Dimier has called in a well-famous book, The Recycling of Empire. Namely, the way in which international organizations relied on colonial knowledge and experts to shape post-colonial politics. And from this point of view, and I conclude, I think that the study of inter-imperial organization can offer interesting perspectives on empires' intertwinement with globalization, but also with the transformation of the international order in the 1950s and in the 1960s. So thank you very much for your attention, and looking forward for the discussion.
Okay. Oh yeah, I can put it there. Excellent.
Click this right forward.
Yeah.
Left backward.
Okay.
This one is
Pointer. Okay. Yeah. I don't think I need that. All right. Thank you everybody for this wonderful conference. What I will do is in the first part of my paper, I will say something about where I'm coming from. And then in the second part of my paper, I will say something about where the remit of this conference has taken me to. So thank you in advance for joining me on this journey. And given the fact that in my pre-circulated papers I went on quite a bit about student mobility, I guess it's appropriate that this paper is a bit of a whistle-stop tour. So first of all, to say where I'm coming from, I'm a historian of internationalism or internationalisms, and by internationalism I refer to different ways in which a variety of actors sought to forge an international community, and that could be carried out through international organizations, it could be carried out by stating international congresses, running international campaigns, as well as a variety of other means. And it's important to acknowledge that in ideological terms, internationalism was highly variegated. There were manifestations of internationalism that were subaltern, communist, socialist, liberal, conservative, and fascist. And that kind of ambivalence and amorphousness also, of course, affected the relationship between internationalism and empire. The history of liberal internationalism was, of course, closely entwined with the history of imperialism, from the rising body of international law in the 19th century to the League of Nations. But there were also forms of internationalism that challenged empire. Obviously, many communists viewed or presented anti-imperialism as being part and parcel of their internationalism. And recently, people have also looked at Pan-Africanism, for instance, as another form of internationalism. In 2019, a special issue of the Journal of World History has looked at the Bandung moment as an example of Afro-Asian internationalism. So there's a number of different ways in which we could explore the relationship between internationalism and empire. Now, over recent years, I've become increasingly interested in the relationship between university students and internationalism, as manifested in different international student organizations, including those that brought together student leaders from different countries. The image on your left is one that I always like to show when I'm in Geneva, because obviously it flatters the audience. This is a map that depicts humanitarian efforts that had their roots in the student Christian movement and that emerged in the aftermath of World War I and subsequently got transformed into an organization called International Student Service. The second image is from the early 1960s and exemplifies some of the, in inverted commas, cultural activities that were characteristic of international student conferences and the showcasing of student culture in those settings. Now, why university students and student organizations and internationalism? Well, of course, we have to acknowledge that university youth were but a small subsection of their age cohorts. They were hardly representatives, but exactly because of that limited nature of that cohort, they could stake claims for future leadership. And this rhetoric was quite prevalent when people spoke about students and their future roles. To cite but one example, the West African Students' Union, which represented West African students in Britain in 1941, in a letter to the British authorities, stated that its members were, quote, aware of their future responsibility as potential leaders of thought and action among their people in West Africa. And of course, one could quote plenty of other examples of such a discourse of students as future leaders. Now, as far as the relationship between internationalism and student leaders is concerned, one major manifestation of internationalism in the realm of students was by an embrace of various forms of educational exchange and the promotion of student travel, which is why in the a pre-circulated version of my paper, the first half is dedicated to discussing student mobility. I'm not going to go into that much detail about this, but suffice to say that international student organizations expressed a strong commitment to different forms of student mobility. Already before 1914, organizations such as the World Student Christian Federation had promoted a particular form of student travel, and then the emerging landscape of international student bodies in the 1920s and 1930s really expressed a commitment to promoting student travel, scholarship schemes, exchanges, correspondence courses, and the image on the left is an example of that, linked to a body called the International Confederation of Students, which sought to organize national students' unions, but also sponsored kind of correspondence courses, etc. So in those respects, the history of student internationalism intersects with the history of student mobility more broadly. And I've explored transimperial features of student mobility in the paper. I'm not saying that all forms of student mobility were transimperial, but some parts of student mobility clearly were, with individuals and sometimes also educational institutions cutting across different configurations, including spaces that were located within empires and spaces that were located outside them, as well as settings that bore the imprint of empire. Now, of course, student mobility was often framed as something neutral, as being tied to training, knowledge acquisition, personal development, and expertise. But of course, it's blatantly obvious that it was inherently political. In some instances, the political nature of mobility schemes was foregrounded. We can think, for instance, of the Communist University of the Toilers of the East in the Soviet Union during the 1920s, or subsequently under Khrushchev in 1960, the creation of the People's Friendship University, which was subsequently renamed as the Patrice Lumumba University. But we can also think about educational schemes by post-colonial states. And more broadly, of course, it's clear that questions of support for student mobility was tied to power and influence. And Paul Kramer's article on American power and student mobility I found highly stimulating in that context. But of course, there was also another form of political activism that could unfold through student mobility, and I discussed that in my paper. Now, just to move to two examples, one of which did not feature in my paper, but is quite instructive to exemplify the kind of transimperial links and circulations that one might trace by looking at student internationalism. In the 1930s, the Communist International was involved in the creation of a new student body, the Rassemblement Universel des Étudiants, the World Student Association, which can be interpreted as part of a number of front ventures that normally ran under the banner of being against war and fascism. The Rassemblement Universel was created in 1934, in December 1934, at a student congress in Brussels. It included also delegates from India, the Dutch East Indies, Algeria, Puerto Rico. And in the mid-1930s, the Rassemblement Universel mobilized on a number of different issues that galvanized radical opinion in that period. That included, of course, Abyssinia from 1936. It included Spain, obviously, and also China quite significantly. So, for instance, in 1936, in March, then, the Rassemblement Universel was involved in a China Solidarity meeting, which took place in London at Bedford College, but which included also the Secretary General of the Organization of Chinese Students in Paris, as well as the person depicted in the center of this image, James Klugman, who had been strongly involved in communist student circles in Cambridge, and then became Secretary General of the Paris-based Rassemblement Universel. Moreover, by 1938, Klugman led an international student delegation that embarked on an international tour, traveling first of all to what was then Bombay, then onwards to Allahabad, where the student delegation met with Nehru, then onwards across India, Singapore, Hong Kong, and ultimately it arrived in Hankou in China, where the student delegation stayed for a while, held some largely attended meetings, met with Mao, but also inspected hostels run by the YMCA and YWCA. And then onwards from China, Klugman traveled to the United States to participate in a broader international event, the Second World Youth Peace Congress that was held at Vassar College in New York State, and which recently in an article for the journal Peace and Change has been appraised as a popular front movement in international student politics, because it also included ostensibly liberal protagonists as well. The second example I can skip over a bit more quickly because it's also in a pre-circulated paper, and this is the story of Cold War student internationals, the two bodies that sought to bring together student leaders in the 1950s and beyond. One of them, the IUS, the International Union of Students, very strongly backed by the Soviet Union. The other one, the International Student Conference, funded, as it turned out, by the CIA largely. And in the 1950s, these two organizations increasingly vied for the support of student organizations in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And this included student leaders from newly independent states, as well as organizations that in some ways were still engaged in an anti-colonial struggle. For instance, the General Union of Muslim Algerian Students, UGMA. And in their kind of congresses, they therefore kind of increasingly paid attention to facilitating the participation of student organizations and student leaders from different regions, and they try to accentuate this aspect in their reports as well. And I guess that kind of relationship between the two Cold War student internationals and an emerging post-colonial world, I guess fruitfully could be studied through the prism that, of course, we've heard repeatedly already with regard to transimperial history and the really stimulating article on this subject, namely connectivity, cooperation, and competition within international student organizations. And one aspect that I was interested in my paper in this context was, for instance, the kind of tours that involved inquiry missions organized by these organizations, and to what extent those missions also allowed, in the case of the student delegation to Africa, organized by the ISC in 1962, to challenge so-called apolitical conceptions of student politics that had been the predominant discourse of the ISC. And it's partly in the wake of this international student delegation to Africa that in 1962, the International Student Conference decides to extend its remit. And in this context, states that alongside opposing colonialism, imperialism, totalitarianism, dictatorship, racism, and social injustice, it now also has to oppose neocolonialism. And so we have two competing student internationals that both in their subsequent publications and activities really put neocolonialism and the opposition to it center stage. So this takes me to the end of my short presentation. And I think it's useful then to think about internationalism from different angles. Obviously, in many cases, internationalism reinforced existing hierarchies. It was a highly asymmetric phenomenon, uneven, but it also provided openings for a variety of actors to also challenge existing structures. And here in the background, you have a kind of document from the National Union of Ghana students, which very successfully engaged with those two competing Cold War student internationals as but one example. And clearly, if we take things into the 1950s and 60s, we're dealing with a rather complex situation, and one that arguably, however, is still transimperial, because to many of the protagonists within these organizations and their events, the legacy and the kind of existence under neocolonial conditions was a predominant concern. But then how do we make kind of sense of the fact that the very embrace of such rhetoric was in itself also a vehicle for attempts for imposing new forms of hegemony, whether that's by the Soviet Union, the United States, or cultural actors that were sponsored by these states. These are just some questions, but it's my contention that the very fact that one is faced with them highlights the value of probing the transimperial dimensions of internationalism. So thank you.
okay to put it here? No worries. Yeah. Well, good morning to you all. Thank you for the invitation to be here. Cyrus, thank you so much. The Fondation Pierre du Bois as well. David, what a marvelous, marvelous work. Thank you as well to the Swiss National Foundation and also to the Geneva Graduate Institute. Thank you all, perhaps as importantly, perhaps no, for sure, as importantly, for so many stimulating ideas and for the kind and rich exchanges in the past 2 days. The text that I submitted to our conference corresponds to a small part of an ongoing larger research, individual but also collective, for instance with my dear friend and colleague DAMIANO MATASCI, about the role played by inter-imperial and intercolonial collaboration in the shaping of the historical trajectories of late colonialism and decolonization after the Second World War. I am doing so fully recognizing the relevance of previous historical dynamics from the late 19th century onwards. I am doing so not obscuring the fact that inter-imperial and intercolonial collaboration had a disputed nature, as they were related to dynamics of competition, of competitive emulation, of selective borrowing and differentiation between governments, but also between technicians, planners, academics, scientists, among others. Acknowledging as well that projects of inter-imperial and intercolonial collaboration entailed various meanings and expectations, opportunities and risks, gains and consequences to those involved. Sometimes cooperation was perceived as implying more threats than advantages, being therefore a cause of concern leading to resistance to its enactment. The costs and benefits of cooperation for each colonial power varied. They also varied to different authorities in Lisbon, London, Paris, Brussels, or varying as well to those in colonial territories, and sometimes we fail to acknowledge this. In this research and in this paper, I focus on the creation and institutional dynamism of the Commission for Technical Cooperation south of the Sahara that Damiano already mentioned, although I am also analyzing the role of the International Institute of Differing Civilizations, formerly International Colonial Institute, studied in depth by Florian Wagner. I'm doing so mining archives in France, Portugal, Belgium, and the UK, and hopefully soon this will also include archives, at least in South Africa, because as Damiano already noted, the Union of South Africa and Southern Rhodesia were also a part of the CCTA. I am particularly interested in understanding the impact of inter-imperial and intercolonial collaboration on some of the following interrelated aspects. First, their impact on the definition of politics and policies that were enacted by the European colonial powers in the late colonial period about several topics, from rural welfare and development to nutrition, mental health, and labor. And how am I doing this? For instance, studying both the production and collection of knowledge and the related epistemic communities, examining the organization and the workings of numerous meetings about many topics in European imperial capitals, but also in Africa, assessing their debates and what they called their recommendations. Finally, also analyzing the creation of particular permanent bodies such as the Inter-African Labour Institute, created in 1952, the Committee on Statistics, created in 1954, or the Centre for Information of Rural Welfare, created in 1955. All these institutional spaces were created to enhance dynamics of knowledge gathering and production, and also to foster technical cooperation on different topics and in different scales. Related to this first aspect, I am also exploring the interactions between metropolitan governments on one hand and colonial administrations on the other, for instance, addressing how local colonial actors actually engaged with external instructions regarding technical cooperation, how they facilitated or even guided and significantly shaped the process, or how they created numerous obstacles to those orientations. Secondly, I am analyzing the impact of post-war inter-imperial cooperation in the evolving relationship between European empire states and international organizations, namely the United Nations and its specialized agencies. Claiming to have the institutional capacity and the relevant expertise to be the key protagonist of the enactment of political, social, economic, and cultural change in Africa south of the Sahara, the CCTA aimed to prevent, to minimize, or even plainly obstruct interventions by the United Nations and its commissions and agencies. How am I trying to do this? Well, investigating how this relationship varied greatly in time and according to the subject and scope of each specialized agency and specific commissions and committees of the UN, from the Trusteeship Council and the Economic Commission for Africa to UNESCO, FAO, WHO, and also the ILO. There is no single story here for different reasons. Third, I'm also trying to understand the ways in which the evolving Cold War dynamics were perceived and debated within the CCTA and how modalities, diverse modalities of inter-imperial collaboration were shaped by perceptions and positionings regarding the competing geopolitical agendas in the late 1940s and especially in the 1950s. For our meeting, I decided to essentially focus on more or less 5 years, dealing with the first interactions that envisioned and actually initiated post-war forms of inter-imperial cooperation that could respond to the perceived but also to the actual challenges posed by the post-Second World War momentum, namely what we could summarize as being the intensification of dynamics of internationalization but also transnationalization of colonialism and, at the same time, anti-colonialism. These interactions, which were bilateral, tripartite, quadripartite, coexisted and multiplied significantly since 1946. Some of them, especially in an Anglo-French angle, were already analyzed by the pioneering work by John Kent, The Internationalization of Colonialism. In the text, I selected some telling illustrations, I hope, of these points of interest, offering some arguments about their relevance. Given time constraints, let me just offer 3 examples. First, I indicated the explosion of themes of technical cooperation, which study was intensely promoted by the CCTA and some by the INCD as well, and here are some. Detribalization, the challenges of the so-called économie indigène, the role of women in tropical development, the problems of diseases, soils, hydrology, communications, housing and sanitary conditions, the emergence of middle classes in the third world, the levels of productivity of rural and industrial labor, the consequences of malnutrition, the uses of community development, including political uses of community development, the requirements of rural welfare and development, or the utility of the social sciences and statistics, and among many others. All these topics were of great importance to the post-war imperial and colonial political, economic, and also techno-scientific imagination, although some were more than others. All were proclaimed to be technical in nature, although they were surely connected to many geopolitical and economic ponderations and goals, some more clearly than others. The CCTA facilitated the international and transnational, but also the inter-imperial and intercolonial, and also the transimperial and transcolonial circulation of experts and expertise, of information and data, of theories and methodologies of social inquiry, of models and instruments of political, social and economic intervention, regulation and control, including about what was called the savoir développer, which greatly animated the post-war momentum. The CCTA, therefore, helped significantly to expand the legibility of the late colonial states and also of the administrations of the Union of South Africa and Southern Rhodesia. It is important to stress that all ideas, arguments, and repertoires of action were, of course, influenced by local actors and dynamics, by their more localized motivations and interests. And Cyrus, thank you so much for emphasizing this point in your comments. Moreover, as a consequence of these dynamics of information gathering, the production and circulation, the CCTA actually sponsored specific programs of intervention, for instance, a huge project called Human Factors of Productivity, while inspiring others, shaping colonial legislation and policies about many of the topics that I just identified. The so-called second colonial occupation, its imperialism of knowledge, its developmental regimes, the dynamics of repressive developmentalism connected to late colonial conflicts cannot be properly understood without these processes promoted by the CCTA. Let me move to the second example. In the paper, I also offer illustrations highlighting the momentous importance for European colonial powers of creating institutional mechanisms to evaluate and collectively answer to news coming from New York and Geneva. I mention how the inter-imperial powers organize numerous, frequently secretive meetings immediately before and after major international gatherings to go through their agenda, aiming at common positions, including votes, and also devising shared strategies to engage, sometimes collaborating, others counteracting with international organizations. Moreover, in all conferences, the UN programs or schemes were addressed, discussed, selectively appropriated, an important point, and frequently criticized. Representatives of the UN were frequently there as observers in these conferences. Therefore, the CCTA also helped to significantly expand the legibility of international organizations, not only of the late colonial states. A proper history of the post-Second World War international organizations, the UN and several specialized agencies, requires, in my view, more attention to the role played by inter-imperial organizations. I will skip the third example, which is connected to the US policies and later to the Soviet interventions because of time, but I can talk about it when we debate our papers. I will therefore conclude. The politics of inter-imperial exchanges and cooperation were plural and multifaceted. They entailed multiple institutional contexts and actors with distinct expectations and resources, interpretations and interests involving diverse topics and processes. Such politics were shaped by, but also shaped diverse, important historical contexts and phenomena, from the specificities of post-war European societies to the particularities of late colonialism, to the challenges caused by evolving decolonization and, of course, the Cold War and the Europeanization dynamics. To engage with this plurality of relevant factors that are crucial to analyze the role of inter-imperial organizations in the post-Second World War moment, but also to understand the dynamism and outcomes of international, inter-imperial and intercolonial cooperation, we desperately need multi-archival and multi-scalar approaches. If methodological nationalism is still, and unfortunately, a problem, so is methodological imperialism. For these and other reasons, we need more refined forms of inter-imperial and transimperial modes of inquiry. And I think we need both, and both need each other. Thank you so much.
Thank you to the panelists. Please move to the table. So we have time until 11:15, and I already see many hands. No. We will collect a couple of questions, starting with Alexander Kese over there, then moving to Harald, and then Eileen Ryle.
Well, Thank you very much. I think the three papers have shown how important these initiatives are. I have a couple of questions that are about, well, the connection between colonial thought in a way and then this inter-imperial thought. First of all, for Damiano and for Miguel, my question would be in which ways do these inter-imperial meetings reinforce or perhaps make disappear stereotypes circulating about what's going on in the other empires? Because, I mean, in formulating responses against nationalist pressures and anti-colonial movements, it's very important what the French think of the Portuguese, think of the South Africans, the British think of the Rhodesians, or the Portuguese, and so on. And of course, in these epistemic communities, as you said, they work together, but what effects does that have on what one thinks of the other side in more concrete colonial administration terms, for example? Second question, Damiano, you mentioned the transition from inter-imperial organizations to politics and technical cooperation linked to the Organization of African Unity. Could you say a bit more how that works? And Miguel, very shortly, you mentioned these secret meetings. How, in your view, does one have to imagine that as a kind of Machiavelli counter strategy? So the international organizations are something that spoils the good late colonial initiatives, and so we need to work against that? Or, well, or is that just anti-communist thought and the fear that communists take over? What are the motives behind that? Thank you. Sorry.
Just a very brief technical announcement. Questions to Niall. Questions have come up online, and questions to Niall Green should be emailed directly to him. Please.
So this makes my intervention much shorter. So
okay.
But I do have questions for Damiano as well. I was a bit surprised when you made this argument that he showed this beautiful cartoon with the bricklayers constructing Africa, and then you said that the emphasis on the civilizing mission was fostered through this scientific cooperation. Was that a term that was still used in the 1950s and 60s? It sounded so 1880s, the Jules Ferry type of argument, and I had expected that the developmentalist role would be stressed rather than the civilizing role of the colonial state. That was the time, with the concepts like the colonialisme donnant and things like that were already en vogue. So I was wondering if that was a concept from the sources or your own term. And then, being completely ignorant of African history, I was also surprised that this happened so late. This delegitimization of European imperialism started through the First World War on a worldwide scale already, and I was wondering is there any prehistory to this advanced cooperation of several imperial powers? Were there any bilateral attempts during the interwar period of combining their knowledge and forging epistemic communities? Thank you.
So we add one more question by Eileen Ryan here up front. And then we give the first round of responses.
Thank you. That was fascinating. I have a question, I think, for all three of you, though there might be some overlap between Damiano and Miguel, which has to do with the gender dynamics of the programming. Damiano, you had these amazing images with women, a couple of white women, and especially that first one. That poor man sitting next to her, he looked so uncomfortable. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about both the social actors involved and the programming. Miguel, you mentioned women and their role in subtropical development. What were the gender dynamics of that? And then also with Danielle, that it seemed like there were a lot of women in your images, and so I was wondering if there were restrictions about it when it came to women as students, or if this was just part of the programming from the get-go was having female university students. And then also for Daniel, I was thinking about translation in relationship to Niall Green's intervention, and I was struck with the English language material you showed, and I wondered if, I mean, all these organizations you were talking about seemed like they were super transnational, but were there divisions based on linguistic legacies of empire? Thank you.
Damiano.
Yes. So first of all, thank you very much for this very stimulating questions and remarks. Maybe I will start with your question, Alexander, about to what extent such a kind of inter-imperial cooperation contributed to deconstruct stereotypes and mutual visions between empires, between colonial experts or administration. I would say that such a kind of inter-African conferences were indeed spaces of course, circulation, where knowledge circulated, and where also knowledge were compared. But I think that it depends on the topic, on the field of research, but it didn't necessarily deconstruct stereotypes between empires. And one example is the field of education, on which I work a little bit, and in education, there were many conferences and meetings were organized on this topic between colonial experts. Colonial education systems were compared, but it was basically impossible because of a set of differences on pedagogical principles and so on. It was difficult to find a common basis, a common denominator, or even to carry out common projects. And even in these conferences, criticism were formulated also vis-à-vis of the organization of the other educational systems. Another point is, which is also a major point, is the question of Africanization. Here I have to confess that at the moment I focused mainly on the colonial period, so on the 1940s. 1950s, but it's very, very interesting to see, as I said in my presentation, to follow the trajectory, the historical trajectory of this organization, which were conceived as purely colonial clubs, and then they finished to be merged with the organization of the African Union. This process began in the mid 1950s. The first countries to be integrated into the CCTA and CSA were Liberia and Ghana, and then many other countries followed in 1960 and 1961. Of course, here I think that more research is needed, especially on more empirical research, is needed to better understand the social and intellectual dynamics that accompanied such a kind of evolution. Also, because I have the impression that the period between 1960 and 1965, technical activities and technical cooperation were quite a little bit paralyzed. Also because a lot of political problems, because former colonial powers were expelled from the organization or became observing members. and also because a lack of financial funding. But I think it's a wonderful topic of research. Maybe quickly about the question, the notion of the civilizing mission. This notion doesn't come from these sources. So I use it just to emphasize the fact that one of the objectives of such a kind of organizations were to showcase the commitment of colonial powers towards the well-being and welfare and development of colonial population. There is an historian, NILE, who talk about a modernizing mission. The idea was to modernize colonialism, and so on.
Do you want to?
I guess there were some questions that were addressed to both of you. So
well, thank you so much, Alex. Well, the first question, it varied greatly and depended a lot on the topic and even the context, the actual context. One thing was to meet in 1949 in London, trying to share what were the policies about education. The other thing would be in 1959 doing the same kind of exercise. So I would say that it varies greatly in the ways in which not only they perceive collectively international organizations, particular colonies, and how they saw each other, and also how they assessed, measured, and appreciated each other's role within the Commission. It also changed. It's a much more complex story than we tend to assume with bold arguments about these organizations, which do not make justice to the huge variety of factors and historical dynamics that are attached to them. I would say that publicly, and sometimes there were instructions in that sense, to restrain publicly from, showing what were their conceptions, appreciations about what the British, the French, the Belgian, or whatever were. But within them, they talked about it frequently, for instance, regarding what to do with South Africa within the club, or what to do with Portugal regarding certain topics, such as labor, not necessarily regarding others, such as, for instance, health or wherever. But there was always this sense, I feel, of what I could call, the instrumental, highly contingent representations of what the others were, and this is important, if they could be useful in a particular moment for a particular national case. So cooperation always entailed comparison for sure, but also differentiation. The problem is that this dynamic changed greatly, even with the topic and the debate. The second point, really important, they had secret meetings, not only before each meeting of the Trusteeship Council, later on the Economic Commission for Africa, the UNESCO meetings on education, immediately before or immediately after, but always with the same kind of goal. First, to try to find a common position regarding their interventions within the meetings, but also immediately after to assess the consequences of the major results of those particular meetings. But curiously enough, they also organized constant meetings before their own CCTA meetings, in order to be sure that these public conferences could not be instrumentally used by those experts that were coming to address things like gender and the role of women in tropical societies, etc. So they tried to control. And that's why a lot of people tend to see these meetings as a mere expression of imperial and colonial or neo-imperial forms of imagination. But the problem is that they failed, because you cannot control naturally people, fortunately, although it seems every day harder to believe in what I'm saying. Anyway, I think that what is actually important is to look to these secretive meetings before as a way to control the agenda, control the narrative. We spoke about this in the first day, but without much success. Regarding gender dynamics, it's a really important problem. I would say that there's, to be brief, two ways of answer to your question. I mean, first, women became a subject matter, a problem. how to think about them regarding household economy, regarding the politics of reproduction, regarding the role that they could play in what was envisioned as the new indigenous native economy, how they could control salaries, for instance, how they could be crucial to deal with detribalization or the exodus from rural areas to urban spaces. So as a problem, but also as a social problem, but also as a social antidote. So this is to put it briefly. The second part was that gradually women appeared as public experts, because they were already experts providing information, documentation, but we will not be invited to speak about a particular topic. But gradually, sometimes for bad reasons, it was considered to be highly relevant to bring them to the table, because after all, we're in topics about nutrition, about rural welfare, about even mental health. They were the key leading social workers that could actually move beyond high politics and present specific cases, specific problems, and even suggest some policy changes. So I would say that in these years, these are two angles that are crucial to start answering your question. Thank you so much.
Okay, so just 3 points. I mean, Alexander, your question was primarily addressed to Miguel and Damiano, but I think you can look at these organizations, student organizations, as inter-imperial fora as well. And if you look at the outputs, so to speak, of these organizations, there are some reports that really address specific contexts of colonies or former colonies. There's some outputs that address imperialism, colonialism, neo-colonialism in general terms, but there's also that in-between aspect which particularly manifests itself at the congresses, where there are these pronouncements of this is the nature of British imperialism, or the nature of French imperialism, and of course that goes into that kind of reproduction of particular stereotypes. That's partly shaped by the political constellations of the present. It reflects an engagement with colonial pasts, but it also intersects with the recent European pasts. So, kind of discussions about racism in these student forums in the 1950s often refer back to the Nazi years and so on. So there's a kind of certain conflation of different issues. As regards Eileen's question about gender, it's a really important aspect. Of course, we're dealing with a period in which the gender dynamics in higher education is slowly starting to shift. And in many ways, when we look at the period between 1920 and 1960 as it manifested itself in international student politics, we can see both actually a very, regressive way of engaging with gender or non-engagement. So when you look at the student delegations, for instance, that get to travel to Africa, they're all male kind of groups. Some of the hosts who were depicted in these images were female, but it's at the leadership level, there's very little reflection, which is all the more striking because by 1960, certainly in The Student, which is the magazine of the International Student Conference, there is a debate about the role of women students at African universities. And the kind of that includes, different and quite contrasting pronouncements, but there's very little reflection about what this means for institutional practice and questions of representation within the organization itself. There are exceptions, and I think two aspects in this context is the story for the kind of student Christian movement would be a slightly different one, because, even the leadership, Ruth Rouse, Susanne Dietrich, they played very important roles in this context. And then the kind of image from the Second Peace Congress, Youth Peace Congress, of course, it's reflective of the fact that it's held at Vassar College as a women's college. So I think there's a certain element to that. And then thirdly, the point about language. I think there's two different aspects one could comment on. I mean, the first aspect is that, of course, we're dealing with a relatively select group of student leaders who've often been socialized in international settings and for whom participation in these organizations in itself is a kind of education in internationalism. and who are probably a little bit more at ease in engaging in these settings, which mostly operate in the English and French languages. Secondly, however, the IUS and the ISC actually have various publication efforts where they publish the same magazine in French, English, and Spanish, and then at some point World Student News also has an Arabic edition as well. So there's an attempt to say, well, if we really want to reach student leaders in those countries, we'll have to also embark on kind of translation projects. And then in the 60s, COSEC, which is the coordinating secretariat of the International Student Conference, it's based in Leiden, embarks on a project with UNESCO where they're also interested in questions of translation. So there's kind of a reflection, but within very clear boundaries as well.
The papers have created a lot of interest. We will have to collect the remaining 10 questions in 15 minutes. So please be really brief. I have on the list first Michael Goebel, just here, then on Isabel Richards, then Paul Kramer, and we take it from there.
Okay, thanks. So I'll try to be brief. I had two questions for Daniel, which come from, so you come to this topic from the angle of internationalism. I only looked at this from the local angle of, let's say, Paris or Berlin, right? And so my first question would be, it seemed to me when, looking at foreign students or foreign-born students in either France or Germany in the 1920s, for example, that only a very small minority of these is formally connected to any sort of international or exchange mechanism or group or organization that has international in its name, right? So I guess, it's an old problem in migration studies. If you want to study Jews in New York, but only look at synagogues, you have a very skewed sample, right? So that would be my first question. How do you deal with this? The other one is that from the angle of, for instance, either German or French institutions or the German or the French state, this entire thing serves very nationalist purposes, especially in the context of the French-German rivalry, with the expectation of renewed military conflict. We need Francophile people or Germanophile people in Serbia or in Chile and so forth, right? So there seems to be this whole nationalist rationale also going on in the background, and I wondered how this fits into your picture.
And Isabel Richard in the middle.
Thank you very much for 3 really interesting papers. I have a question, and for each of you, but the first question is more of a comment now for Damiano, and it relates to the Africanizing, because I was very struck how you said they're flexible institutions, and then they sort of become Pan-Africanized, and Africans were integrated. But what I was wondering, and you reflected on that, how they positioned themselves, and I was thinking of 2 sort of ways to get at that, and one is thinking of how this sort of colonial practices in a way continued after decolonization, with, for example, thinking about all these French coopérants who are all across Francophone Africa. But at the same time, I was thinking of the recent PhD by Larissa Schulte-Nordholz about Africanizing African history, about the UNESCO World History, and all the debates about, we need Africans to really be in charge. So that's why I was very curious, and I guess that might be something to think about for later, how Africans saw themselves being integrated in these explicitly colonial institutions, and why not just sort of stop and really start anew. I guess that happened later. A question for Daniel. At the end, or in your paper, at a certain point, there is this comment, we really need to reach out to students in Africa or in wherever, and in Latin America. And I was curious because Well, this conference is very much about inter-imperial or transimperial, but Latin America, and in general, I think in this geography, Latin America is sort of left out. At the same time, talking to Latin Americanists, they see all these connections, and you very much, and by the time you get to the NILE, these connections are very clearly there. But I was just wondering how you see Latin America featuring in this story if you take a transimperial or interimperial lens. And I had a small question about this Rassemblement Universel d'étudiants. Is this a forerunner to the Rassemblement Universel de la Paix, which is founded 2 years later in Brussels, which is also this communist and partly communist organization. And then finally for Miguel, and that actually is a question about terminology, because what I found really interesting in your paper, and I sort of did a Control-F search for imperial and colonial, transimperial, interimperial, and intercolonial and transcolonial. And I was curious if you could elaborate on which term you use when and why that is. Thank you.
If you can hand it over right to Paul, and no, to your right, yes, and after that Ulrike von Hirschhausen, right to the right.
Yeah, well, thank you all for wonderful papers. And my comment actually picks up from Anne Isabel's a little bit, and it has to do with the politics of whose knowledge gets to count as authoritative, and whose knowledge doesn't, or even whose knowledge gets to count as knowledge, which in a way sort of unfolds in different ways in all three of these remarkable papers. In the case of Damiano and Miguel with the CCTA, I was thinking that one of the functions of imperial technocracy is to make Asian, African people non-experts on their own societies and geographies. Right? It's actually to kind of create a cultural and intellectual politics in which forms of knowledge are demoted, right, in the interest where authoritative knowledge can only come from without. And you can only become an expert on your own society by routing your intelligence through these idioms that come from metropolitan centers. And so what I was wondering is if in the cases that you're studying, that can be thematized critically in public. Like, are there contexts where people can think about or debate sort of who gets to be authoritative and whether, forms of African or Asian knowledge, right, or forms of knowledge and knowing epistemologies coming from colonized societies can count as authoritative knowledge, or whether technocracy, is the only kind of epistemology through which colonial societies can be known. So can that asymmetric power dynamic be critically thematized, and in what settings? And then for Daniel, a similar question, which is that, when people talk about these international student migrations, the language of exchange, right, is always there in the official documents. But we know from looking at the geographies that these are not exchanges, right? These are very, as you said, very asymmetric migrations. And I'm wondering, is there anybody in the documents, either program officers, students themselves, who can critically thematize the patterns of who goes to travel and learn from who, and who doesn't go to travel and learn from who?
Ulrike von Hirschhausen.
It's already done.
You're already done, good. Then we move on to Ben Zachariah, two rows back.
So I had a quick comment on interest and expertise and native information, and then I had a question which is addressed to all three speakers. So the question of what is an expert is usually ambiguous, because you do want native expertise, but it's very easy to demote a native expert to either an interested party or merely to a native informant. But that really depends on whether he's on message or not. And this, I think, plays through a lot of the information. But what I wanted to ask, mainly Miguel and Damiano, but also Daniel, is the role of finance and economics in a number of these phenomena, especially since Miguel mentioned in passing the second colonization of Africa. And I'm wondering whether in these cooperative ventures you have any echoes of what is a real urgent matter of balancing colonial books after the Second World War. The inter-allied debt payments, sterling balances, the need to earn hard currency versus the need to save hard currency by not providing certain colonies with imports that they need. And whether, in fact, among the cooperative movements across colonies, you can actually mention this, or whether this is suppressed, and whether, in fact, the students mention it.
Then we move to the back to Véronique and then Nadine.
Thank you. It's a question for Daniel. I'm just wondering if you're working on the post-imperial, post-colonial exchange of students, and if you see similar patterns which are reproducing colonial patterns. I'm just wondering because I was part of some years ago in evaluation by the EU of kind of exchange program. It was not an exchange program, it was more about collaboration between university within the context of the Genève conference. And it happens that one British university, I won't say which one, they propose a project for global, to link different university and different students to think about global development, and then only involve British Anglo-Saxon universities. So basically, even Senegal was kicked out of their network, which was very strange for an EC project to be financed. In fact, they didn't get the money because they forgot to put some clear budget in the end. But what is interesting is my colleagues didn't point out these. I was the only one working on empire saying, but look, I mean, there are other universities and the British one in Africa. Why didn't, for EC project, why didn't they involve those guys, you know? And concerning, I was just pointing out concerning the stereotypes in the cooperation, I'm thinking of the book of Boncasse, which has been working on the food security and the CTA, and also the book of Lynn Pearson on CTA and health. And they both show how the French were very concerned about what the British were thinking about them. And they had a specific press, press services, which were collecting all what the British were saying on the French, to be sure that they were saying true things. So at some time there is competition, but also collaboration, but also fear of and kind of competition. Battle of legitimation, probably, as I already mentioned in my paper. And the fact is, in a recent paper, Sarah Stockwell spoke about the attempt by the British to send stagiaires to the French development services before decolonization, after decolonization, to see how the French were doing, basically, with the same ideas that the French were in any way doing less good than the British, but you had to be sure. So they sent some experts and some stagiaires. It was very, very interesting.
Okay, thank you for the wonderful papers. My question is more sort of a historiographical one. So in the literature on developmentalism in international sort of organizations, there's in a way a shift that would sort of recently move away from let's say just talk about neocolonialism, but rather focus on the various actors and sort of the leverage a couple of actors have. And my question is in particular also connected to this sort of question of hierarchization of knowledge. So how would you position yourself in there? Is it, because I mean, it's kind of all over now with neocolonialism, then the Transimperial. So how would you position yourself in this broader literature on this topic, especially when it comes to sort of the history of knowledge that is also involved in this? So would you still sort of say that there's this transfer of knowledge from the global south, the global north to the global south, which is kind of the common narrative, or would you sort of aim at correcting that, or where would you see yourself in this broader sort of discourse?
Last two questions I have on the list are by Alexander Morrison in the middle and by Mark Palin on the right.
Just very quickly to Damiano and Miguel. Miguel mentioned towards the end of his paper responses to Soviet development projects in Africa, and I was wondering, yes, just how aware they are of that particular challenge as your actors are as decolonization progresses.
My question is for Daniel. and it's this, the question of empire in the Cold War, and that is, I noticed that the American Empire and the Soviet Empire go unmentioned in the paper, and that's often how we see the Cold War nowadays, and I feel like this might be a problem for some of your studies of these student movements, because the Cold War is so writ large here. Some being supported by the United States, some being supported by the Soviets. Maybe by the 1960s, even within the ISC, you have this neo-colonial critique, maybe being at least subtly being focused towards the American Empire in this context. But my hunch is that they're either unwilling or unable to recognize the Soviet Empire at this point, and so what sort of difficulties this creates, or maybe they did recognize it. That would be my question.
So the panelists, of course, should have the last word, even if we're running out of time. You can, of course, choose whatever you'd like to address in your final statement on all these excellent questions.
Okay, well, I'll start. I mean, there's a lot of questions, and it's a really testimony to what a great conference this is. I'll start with the most empirical question from Anne-Isabelle about the kind of institutional history of some of those ventures. So it actually goes back to what is known as the Amsterdam Plale movement, the Rassemblement Mondial Universel des Étudiants is basically a kind of that earlier movement against war and fascism. There's also a Women's World Committee against war and fascism. So that goes back to the early 30s. And then what you refer to, the Rassemblement Universel de la Paix, is a 1936 venture that in many ways builds on that, but it successfully then becomes more than a front venture, because it is that kind of period of the Popular Front when some of these alliances are real. They're not just there on paper. So I think that's the different context. I think Latin America is really interesting, and I think in the paper I mentioned these kind of student delegations to Latin America, but because of the United States' interest in Latin America, it is a much more ambivalent kind of story, and I think that kind of is something that perhaps ties in with the question at the end. I mean, given the word limit, I didn't really want to get into the question to what extent we can see the IUS, the ISC as vehicles for Soviet and American empire. But of course, that's the subtext in many ways. I mean, the question to what extent do you have something which ostensibly is a forum for critiquing all different kinds of domination, and at the same time, below the surface, of course, advances new forms of domination. I mean, that's the subtext. If I were to kind of elaborate on that, that's the angle worth exploring. With regards to Michael's questions, and I mean, I really enjoyed and used your book on Paris in this context, and I think my point is, well, when you look at organized students, I mean, even beyond the kind of groups that have international in their name, it is a minority of students who get involved in associations at those levels. I mean, in many cases, the most successful forms of student action are in the realm of sports rather than politics. But, of course, there's a virtue of looking at a more limited group of actors, in particular when they are the ones who then do take on leading roles in, for instance, anti-colonial movements, as I guess figures in your book, or in diplomacy, as I could cite some examples from that. So in that sense, it is a far from representative sample of a group that in itself is far from representative of their age cohort. But because of the roles that they take on, I think there's still a value for looking at them. That kind of question about the national and that kind of competition that also in some cases is a story that is very much couched or contextualized by European history, Franco-German antagonism, very much so. And I think I try to nod to that a little bit in the paper in terms of how support for all kinds of mobility schemes is part of a story of national rivalry as well. I found the questions by Paul and by Ben about what knowledge gets to count, what is validated. It's really important, that kind of question about in some cases what some of those kind of organizations do is strategic. They put things into a report they acknowledge some kind of points in which the voices of those experts may have been inconvenient. So they show, look, we are diverse and we are actually accepting of criticism, but of course you can publish all different kinds of things. And then if you don't do anything with it, then of course it becomes more of a symbolic kind of way of trying to showcase diversity without really changing the ways in which you operate. So I think that's what I would say at this level, and that includes the kind of question about who gets to go. There's very little critique about who gets to participate in those schemes. And then finally, Veronique, about this kind of question about, you know, the contemporary higher education landscape. I mean, that's a massive topic, and beyond those questions of language and lenses, you could also mention these kind of questions of overseas campuses and partnerships of British universities, American universities, a lot of others, and to what extent they also build on this idea, well, the world has something to learn from us, and so on. And if you look at where they're located, I mean, there's an imperial link to that as well. But there's also another story, and that is the question of how overseas students get conceptualized, and the very notion of the overseas student as someone who, in the 1960s, 1970s, there are some international students who are not counted as overseas students because they're seen as, reflecting earlier patterns of student mobility that was European, North American, and so on, and then overseas students often, become subject to different fees regime. There's all different kinds of elements to that as well. But I think I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Trying to be as quick as possible. And Isabel, thank you so much. Well, I wanted to highlight how we actually have to simultaneously disaggregate levels of analysis, but also be aware that we need to articulate them further on or later on. In this sense, for me, Interimperial basically pushes me towards the debates that we're having, that were occurring between, empire states, mainly in Europe, mainly by ministries of each colonial power. They were trying to devise a plan to further intellectual cooperation. But I wanted to stress that there was another level that I called intercolonial, that it was actually more defined, shaped and constrained many times by colonial administrations, which already had connections going on and tried to shape this overall project of inter-imperial cooperation coming from Lisbon or whatever. So at the same time, I wanted to disaggregate them, saying we have different phenomena here. We cannot think that they are the same, that these people were pushing for the same goals or using the same resources or thinking about similar interests and goals. They were not. And they collided frequently for several reasons. So I wanted to highlight that we have these two levels. We could add others because in the intercolonial level, there's a lot of people, participating in these debates. Not only governors, not only MC, but a lot of technicians, local scientists, travelers, etc., etc. So this was basically the idea. They are not the same, but we need to think about them together. Thank you, Paul, for your question. It was not an open debate, but bear in mind, and this is something I consider to be relevant, that suddenly with this huge project of technical cooperation on so many topics, one of the consequences immediately in the late 1940s was the acknowledgement that there were no actual human and financial resources to carry all these issues to what was conceived to be the major goal. So I would argue that they were forced to recognize that they had to change regarding the relation with local colonial knowledge, including from European centers or experts, but also local, what some people call indigenous knowledge, and they needed to change, and they were forced to change. That is to say that gradually in the 1950s you see the opening up to local testimonies, local arguments, and this is connected to the need of forming technicians, forming statisticians, forming social workers, forming those that could carry out the major surveys that they implemented, and suddenly knowledge although it continued to be unequal, it continued to be highly hierarchical, it continued to be clearly controlled, monitored by those who had the power, change in a way. And just one final note, there was this really interesting commission on social and human sciences that was created within the CTA, and you start seeing debates about what kind of knowledge can we produce in order to understand these realities, and therefore who can speak more authoritatively about it. To put it, I can develop more. Regarding the finance colonialism, I would basically point to examples in quickly. There was this huge obsession to talk about who is going to pay for this regenerative form of colonialism, of course. And the major obsessions in the late 1940s is, of course, what Truman and the US were going to do, especially regarding Point 4, but also with the early steps of the Organization for Economic, European Economic Committee and also the Overseas Territories, the Committee for Overseas Territories, how to basically channel particular funds. So how can we, in our project, the CCTA, actually get our hands, to put it simply, in particular funds in order to sustain these new development efforts. Sorry for being so brief. Nadine, a single sentence, I would say, there's no single story, there's no single methodology that I'm interested in, there's no single historiography. When I hear those big claims and big arguments on one side or the other, I'm always pushed to see not what they are saying, but what they are not enabling me to understand and know more. So I'm afraid that there's so many people on those two sides of the spectrum that they don't need an additional voice there. Well, Alexander, briefly, where the fears with the Soviet dynamics emerged later in the 1950s was not necessarily about the plans, but was essentially what they saw as the permeating language, political project, etc., in the United Nations committees and commissions, and also on several, not all, specialized agencies. So it was a mediated fear, so to speak, that would increase during the 50s. But when the CCTA ends, the problem is elsewhere, and to put it briefly. But it was there, sure.
Damiano, very brief final statement.
Yes, I mean, very quickly on 2 points. First, regarding the question of the expectations of African actors towards inter-African cooperation, and towards more particularly the Africanization of this cooperation. I will say very briefly 2 points. There are two arguments. First, it was the fact to integrate a space of cooperation, of technical cooperation that was still existing. And second, it was also the possibility, by integrating this space of cooperation, to take advantage of technical assistance program from European countries. And of course, as we are at the end of the 1950s, this was a major question, because if you look at France was already preparing the system of cooperation, which will be implemented starting from the 1960s. And very briefly, just to conclude about the question about the historiography, but I will say that it's a very personal vision, that this topic on Inter-imperial organization allows to decentering the history of empire, and also to unveil particular dynamics of knowledge production and circulation, and also I think better understand, and it's an interesting point, the transition between the colonial and the post-colonial period.
Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to the audience for engaging with those papers.